Hey everybody, Daniel here from Basement Tech. I've said many times it's really unfair that I get to have so much fun, but this one was such a blast I felt like I needed to share it with you. What you see in front of you is a surplus spindle motor from a Tormach mill. We acquired a pair of these a couple years ago, put them on the shelf, and knew that someday we'd want to use them to make some kind of a really cool motor-driven machine. The motor itself is a 1.5 horsepower 220 volt 3-phase motor. We acquired it together with its controller, just this raw circuit board, without any wiring or documentation. So therein laid the challenge where I had to find the documentation. In the end, after much Googling and getting pretty darn close, I read the fine print, and you can see it there, www.mineric.com. It turns out it's their controller that Tormach uses under their own part number, and I was able to find the full documentation, full and clear documentation that allowed me to do the wiring. This little VFD, it's a speed controller for those of you who aren't familiar. It's really quite remarkable. It has a voltage doubling capability in that it takes 120 volt single phase in and puts out the 3 phases that are needed to drive that 3-phase motor, not at 120 volts, but at 220 volts, which is what the motor demands. It has all kinds of controls to fine-tune the motion in terms of min speed, max speed, accel, decel, all kinds of really cool things. It has braking as well, but I'm not taking advantage of that. It takes as its input quite a variety of different configurations. It'll do a 4 milliamp current loop, it'll do 0 to 5 volts, and it does several other things as well. I've got it wired with this pot to control the speed manually. That's essentially a 0 to 5 volt input that it uses. So it's all wired up and it actually works, which is really pretty darn cool. We're going to turn this into a disc sander, variable speed, variable direction disc sander that's going to be extremely capable here in the shop. One question I had is how fast is it running? Being the electrical engineer that I am, I decided I needed to measure that. I actually went all the way back 30 years ago to college and remembered I had this fun little circuit board that you can see here. And all it is an infrared LED and an infrared sensor. And when you interrupt the flow, when you interrupt that beam, that light beam, I can see the little pulse on the scope. And way back in college, we got credit for this as a project by measuring the speed of a Dremel up to 20,000 RPMs. I'll fire it up here in a minute and you'll see the little blips. There you see the steady state 5 volts from the beam not being interrupted. And if I spin the motor around by hand, you might be able to, well, it's going just a little, there it is. You can see the little blip. These blips actually trigger really well and enable me to calculate the speed of one rotation and therefore calculate the RPMs. Let me press pause here and I'll bring you back when it's running. All right, so here's the motor up and running. It's running in sort of the mid section of its speed range. I've got that pot about in the middle. And up here on the scope, you can see these very clear negative going pulses when the zip tie that's on the shaft passes in front of the light beam. That's 8 divisions on the oscilloscope times 5 milliseconds. And converting that all the way to RPMs is 1500 RPMs, which is kind of in the range I would expect, which is very cool. Now, as I vary the speed, just to validate the process, you can see that the interval, that time interval, gets smaller and smaller as the speed goes up and up. And I've calculated that the max speed is up at about, say, 3,400 RPM. So this range of speed is going to be perfect for this application. Well, there you have it, some electromechanical and electrical engineering fun down here in the lab portion of the Zim Knives shop. If you like this kind of sort of quick video on interesting topics, please give it a thumbs up. If you really like it, subscribe. And if you want to be the first one to see it, definitely say, give me notifications when new videos arrive. Thanks for tuning in and talk to you soon.